She stopped in the doorway. Not a polite pause. Not a moment of surprise. Her whole body locked up the second she saw attorney Renata Osei sitting at the conference table, the manila folder open, and me calm, hands folded, already in my chair. I had pressed send on the email to Renata the afternoon Juniper came home from school. That was 3 weeks before this meeting. 3 weeks of her thinking everything was fine. 3 weeks of me sitting with the knowledge that what my daughter had said out loud in that classroom had changed everything, and not saying a single word about it. Pressing send had felt quieter than I expected. I'd been holding so much for so long that I think I assumed the moment I finally acted, I would feel something enormous. Instead, there was just this exhale, like a window cracking open in a room that had been sealed for years. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything. But we are not at the doorway yet. To understand why she froze, you have to understand what came before it. All of it. Because this story did not start with a 7-year-old standing at the front of her classroom holding a papier-mâché volcano and accidentally undoing 8 months of careful adult manipulation. It started much earlier than that. It started the day I married Theo. If you tend to stay until the very end of stories like this one, consider subscribing before we go any further. New stories go up regularly, and this one is just getting started. The morning of the school call, I was sitting at my desk at the county assessor's office going through property transfer records, standard Tuesday work for someone whose entire professional life is organized around documentation and chain of custody. There is a particular kind of attention required for that job. You are always looking for the thing that is slightly off, the signature that doesn't quite match, the date that doesn't line up. 7 years of that work had trained me to notice discrepancies the way other people notice weather. My phone lit up with a number I recognized immediately. Clearwater Elementary. I stepped into the hallway to take the call. Juniper's teacher, Mrs. Adiz Pemberton, spoke carefully. She told me that during show and tell, while the class was sharing items from home, Juniper had held up a small painted river stone, the one we had found together on a camping trip the previous spring, and had started to tell the class about it. And then, mid-sentence, Juniper had stopped. And she'd said, in the specific open way that 7-year-olds say things they have been holding, that her stepmommy told her never to tell mommy, but she wanted everyone to know that the rock was her favorite because her mommy gave it to her and not her stepmommy. Mrs. Pemberton paused after that. Then she said there had been more. That Juniper had mentioned, in the same breath, things about conversations at home. Things she'd been asked to keep private. Things a child that age should not have been asked to carry. I stayed in the hallway for a moment after the call ended. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. Someone down the corridor was running a copy machine. The ordinary sound of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I went back to my desk, opened a new email, and typed Renata Osei's name in the address field. Why did it take me 3 years to get to that email? That is the question I have asked myself more times than I can count. The honest answer is that I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept filing things away and hoping the file would stay empty. It didn't. I had met Theo Castellano at a City Parks board meeting 6 years ago. I was there representing the assessor's office on a land boundary question. He was there because his landscaping company had a contract with the city. He was warm and funny, and he had this habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he was listening to someone really listening, not just waiting for his turn, and I found that genuinely disarming. We dated for 1.5 years before we got engaged. In that time, I met his family gradually, the way you do when you are trying not to rush things. His parents were kind and low-key. His older sister, Bev, was reserved but not unfriendly. And then there was Nadine. Nadine Castellano was Theo's younger sister. Not his ex-wife, not his stepmother, not anyone connected to me by blood or legal tie of any kind. She was my husband's biological sister, which made her my sister-in-law, and that is the only category she ever occupied, no matter what she seemed to believe about her own authority in our lives. Nadine was 34 when Theo and I got married. She was a real estate agent in the same county where we lived, which meant she knew the value of every property in a 20-mile radius, and she had strong opinions about everything from kitchen renovations to child-rearing philosophies. She had never been married. She did not have children of her own. And from the very first family dinner I attended as Theo's girlfriend, I noticed that she had a particular way of positioning herself at the center of any room she walked into, not loudly, but consistently, like a piece of furniture that gets rearranged while you are not watching. Juniper was 4 when Theo and I got married. She is my biological daughter from my first marriage to a man named Davis Lark, who had moved to Portland for work 2 years prior and maintained an inconsistent but genuinely loving long-distance relationship with his daughter. Davis and I had parted on civil terms. We co-parented without drama. He was not part of what was about to unfold. Theo had no children of his own. He had taken to Juniper with a gentleness that I had watched carefully and believed was real. For the first several months of our marriage, the household felt like something that was actually working. Nadine came over on Sundays. That was the pattern from the beginning. Sunday dinners. She would bring something, a bottle of wine, a dessert, something for Juniper. I noticed early that the things she brought for Juniper were always slightly too old for a 4-year-old. A book aimed at 8-year-olds. A craft set with pieces too small for a preschooler's hands. I mentioned it to Theo once, gently, and he laughed and said Nadine just didn't know kids that well. I accepted that. By the second Christmas, I had noticed something else. Nadine had started speaking to Juniper directly in a way that bypassed me. Not rudely. That's what made it hard to name. She would crouch down to Juniper's level and have these low, confidential-feeling conversations. When I came into the room, they would both look up. Juniper would be smiling. Nadine would straighten and say something breezy, and the conversation would become general again. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself I had the professional habit of looking for discrepancies where there were none. I started keeping a notebook in January of the second year. Nothing dramatic. Just dates and brief descriptions. The way I kept notes at work. A habit of record. The summer after that, Theo's company landed a city contract that had him working longer hours. Nadine started coming over on Saturdays as well. She framed it as helping out. She would pick Juniper up from a play date if I was stuck at work late, bring her home, have her fed by the time I arrived. I was grateful. I want to be honest about that. There were moments when Nadine's presence in our lives looked entirely like generosity, and I accepted it as such. One of those evenings, I came home to find Juniper already bathed and in pajamas, sitting on Nadine's lap in the living room while Nadine showed her something on her phone. When Juniper saw me, she scrambled down and ran over. Nadine locked her phone screen in a single smooth motion. I noticed it the same way I notice a signature that doesn't match. I said nothing. I opened my notebook when I got to the bedroom. 3 years in, something shifted that I could not have named at the time, but that I can see clearly now. Nadine's behavior toward me became less neutral. She began making small corrections in front of Theo. The way I had packed Juniper's lunch. The brand of sunscreen I used. Nothing accusatory, just adjustments, offered with the tone of someone who knows better. Theo would look at me with a mild apologetic expression and then agree with his sister, which was its own kind of communication. There was one evening that fall that I have thought about many times since. We were all sitting at the dinner table and Juniper had told a story about her day at school, about a friend who had been mean to her on the playground. I was asking questions, trying to understand how Juniper had felt. Nadine cut across me very quietly and said to Juniper, "You know you can always tell me these things, even when other people are busy." She did not look at me when she said it. Juniper looked between us, trying to read the room the way children do when they sense something they cannot name. I wrote it down that night, word for word, as best I could remember it. The false peace came the following spring. Nadine had a difficult stretch. She lost a property sale she'd been counting on, and for about 2 months she was less present on weekends. She came to one Sunday dinner and was subdued, and at one point she reached across and squeezed my hand when I said something that made her laugh. I remember thinking, sitting there, that maybe the tension had been circumstantial. Maybe this was who she actually was underneath the positioning. I almost stopped writing in the notebook. I didn't stop. Not entirely. I wrote less. But I kept the file. By the following winter, she was back. And something had changed in the nature of it. It wasn't occasional and oblique anymore. She started asking Juniper questions about her week in a way that was structured, almost like an interview. What did Mommy say? What did Daddy say? Did Mommy seem upset about anything? Juniper was 6 by then, old enough to give detailed answers and not quite old enough to understand why someone might want them. I heard one of these exchanges through the kitchen doorway without being seen. I stayed still and listened. When I walked in, Nadine looked up without visible concern and offered me a cup of the tea she'd made. I took it. I thanked her. And I went back to my notebook that night and I wrote down every word I had heard. Mrs. Pemberton at Clearwater Elementary had already been in contact with the school counselor by the time she called me. That was the day I understood that what Nadine had been doing with my daughter was no longer a family tension I could manage privately. She had been coaching a 6, then 7-year-old child to keep conversations secret from her mother for the better part of a year. That is not a personality conflict. That is a deliberate, sustained campaign. And it had been running inside my daughter's mind every single day. I pressed send on that email to Renata and I felt the window open. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I wanted to burn anything down, but because there was no more waiting. The fuse had already reached the powder. All that was left was the sound. The notebook came first. A standard composition book, black and white cover, the kind I used in college. I bought it at a drugstore on my lunch break in January of the second year, the same week I had seen Nadine lock her phone screen in that single smooth motion. I told myself I was probably overreacting. I bought the notebook anyway. I dated every entry in the upper right corner, the same way I dated every property record at work. Short, factual descriptions. No editorializing, because editorializing is the first thing that makes documentation useless. If I wrote, Nadine made me feel small at dinner, that was my interpretation, and it was worthless. If I wrote, Nadine told Juniper, in my presence, that she could always tell her things even when other people were busy, exact words as best I can reproduce, 7:15 in the evening, Theo present, Juniper present, that was a record. The distinction mattered to me because I had spent 7 years watching property disputes hinge on exactly that difference. Feelings don't survive a formal proceeding. Documented specifics do. By spring of the second year, the composition book had 43 entries. I kept it in a fire safe in my home office, which I had always kept locked, a habit from before Theo that I had never bothered to change. I also started a parallel digital file, a folder on my personal laptop, not the shared household computer, titled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me. Into that folder went screenshots. Text messages Nadine had sent me that had a particular quality to them, the kind of message that sounds helpful on the surface, but functions as a correction. A text from the fall of year 2 that said, Juniper mentioned she doesn't love her new after-school snack situation. I told her I'd talk to you. Probably just a phase. I had saved that one within an hour of receiving it. It looked like a caring sister-in-law passing along feedback. What it was Nadine inserting herself as Juniper's confidant and then leveraging that position to communicate criticism of my parenting through my own child. I saved 17 texts like that over the course of 2 years. The second piece of evidence I considered significant came from Juniper herself, and it came in the way that children give you information sideways, without warning, while you are doing something else entirely. We were driving home from her ballet class in March of the 3rd year. She was 5. She was looking out the window and she said, completely unprompted, Auntie Nadine says some things are just for us girls. I kept my eyes on the road. My hands were steady on the wheel. What kinds of things? I asked her. I kept my voice light. The particular lightness you learn when you need information and you know that any change in tone will close the door. Juniper shrugged the way 5-year-olds shrug, her whole body participating. Like about the house and stuff. And about you and Daddy sometimes. Does she say not to tell me? Another shrug. She says some things are private. I said, that makes sense, baby. Everybody has private things. And then I changed the subject to what she wanted for dinner because she was 5 years old and I was not going to make her feel like a witness. That night I wrote it down. Every word as close as I could reconstruct it. Date, time, location, Juniper's exact phrasing. I saved a voice memo on my phone of myself reciting the exchange aloud while it was still fresh, because I had learned at work that verbal records made close in time to an event carry more weight than ones reconstructed later. I sat with that entry for a long time before I closed the notebook. My friend Rosario Vega was the only person outside that locked office who knew what I was keeping. Rosario and I had met years ago through a county planning committee and had become the kind of friends who skip the small talk and go straight to the thing that is actually happening. She was a licensed social worker with a background in family systems, which meant that when I finally told her over coffee on a Saturday morning in early spring of the third year, she did not look at me like I was overreacting. She set her cup down. How long has this been going on? Since about 6 months into the marriage. She was quiet for a moment. She had this habit when she was thinking carefully. She would press the tips of her fingers together into a steeple and look at a point slightly above the middle distance. She did that now. Has Juniper ever indicated she feels pressured to keep these things private? She said some things are private. She's 5. She doesn't have the language for pressure. But she told you anyway. Rosario looked at me directly. That's important. Children that age will tell the truth sideways if they trust you enough. The fact that she told you at all, even obliquely, means she's looking for permission to say it out loud. I had already known that on some level. Hearing it from someone with the professional vocabulary to name it made the notebook entries feel less like paranoia and more like preparation. What are you thinking about doing? Rosario asked. I'm not sure yet. I want to have enough. Her expression shifted slightly. Enough for what? Enough that no one can call it a misunderstanding. She nodded slowly. She did not tell me I was making too much of it. That was why I had told her. The third piece of evidence arrived in a way I had not anticipated. Theo had asked me to go through some boxes in the garage in October of the third year. We were reorganizing, making space. In one of the boxes, tucked inside a plastic sleeve behind some old warranty cards, I found a printed email exchange. I almost put it back. Then I looked at the dates. The exchange was between Nadine and someone named Priya, a friend of hers I had met once at a barbecue. The emails were from the first month of my marriage to Theo. In them, Nadine described, in conversational detail, her concerns about my parenting of Juniper. She used the phrase, the situation with the child, more than once. She described my parenting style as hands-off when it's inconvenient for her. She told Priya that she intended to make sure Juniper always had a real female presence who actually prioritizes her. I stood in the garage for a long moment with the printed email in my hand. The dates were what locked something in place for me. This had not begun as a reaction to something I had done or said during the marriage. This had begun before the marriage was a month old. Before Nadine had spent any meaningful time in our household. Before she could have formed a genuine impression of my parenting based on anything real. This was not a concerned sister-in-law who had developed doubts about me over time. This was a decision she had made from the beginning. I photographed the email with my phone. I returned the printed copy to the sleeve exactly as I had found it. I put the box back where it had been. I went inside and I sat at my desk and I added the photograph to the digital folder and I wrote in the notebook for a long time. A few weeks after finding the email, I had a conversation with Theo that I had been trying to have for over a year. Not about Nadine specifically. I had learned that conversations about Nadine with Theo went in a particular direction that was not useful. This conversation was about Juniper. About whether Theo had noticed anything in how Juniper talked about her time with his sister. Whether Juniper had ever said anything to him that gave him pause. Theo was at the kitchen counter making coffee. He had this way, when he was about to sidestep something, of becoming very focused on whatever his hands were doing. He became very focused on the coffee. Nadine loves Juniper, he said. You know that. I'm not questioning whether she loves her. I'm asking if you've noticed anything. He poured the coffee. Like what? Like whether Juniper has said things to you that suggest she's being asked to keep information from me. He turned around then. His expression was the careful one, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd already prepared. She's Juniper's aunt. She has her own relationship with her. That's normal. Theo, what do you want me to say? From the doorway of the kitchen, I want you to take me seriously. He looked at his cup. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, I do take you seriously. I just think you see patterns that aren't always there. It's how your brain works. I let that sit. I did not argue it. I went back to my desk. I wrote it down. The fourth piece of evidence was Mrs. Pemberton's phone call, but what made it evidence was not the call itself. It was what Mrs. Pemberton told me she had already written down before she dialed my number. She had a standard incident documentation protocol. She had used it. By the time I spoke to her, there were 2 written records in the school's formal system, one from the classroom aide who had been present, and one from Mrs. Pemberton herself. Both documented Juniper's exact words. Both were time-stamped before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What my daughter had said in that classroom was now institutional record. It did not exist only in my notebook. It existed in a system that had protocols and reporting chains and obligations I had not created and could not be accused of manufacturing. I asked Mrs. Pemberton to have both documents forwarded to an email address I gave her, my personal account, not the one on Juniper's school file, which Theo also had access to. She said she would. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was, which was true in the sense that mattered. I called Renata Osei from the hallway outside my office and reached her voicemail. I left a message that was about 45 seconds long and covered the essential facts without editorializing. Renata had handled our initial custody framework when Theo and I married, and she had a particular quality I valued. She did not react before she had information. She called me back in under an hour. Her voice had the careful precision of someone who has heard a great many things and does not allow her face to move prematurely. Send me everything tonight, she said. The school documents when they arrive, the folder, the notebook entries, photograph each page. Anything you have. I have a lot. A brief pause. Good. That's what I need. That was the moment I understood that I had been building towards something specific for 3 years without knowing exactly what it was. What I had been building toward was this phone call. What I had been building was the kind of record that a family law attorney calls a lot and means it as a professional assessment. I had enough. I had known I had enough on some level, since the garage. But Rosario had been right when she'd told me months earlier that knowing and being ready are 2 different states. The school documents made me ready. Because now the record existed outside my home, outside my locked office, outside anything I had created or could be accused of coloring with my own bias. It existed in a classroom, on a school server, in the handwriting of a teacher who had no stake in my marriage. I spent that evening going through every entry in the composition book. I photographed each page in order, flat on my desk under the lamp, making sure the dates were legible. I exported the digital folder to a secure cloud account I had set up through the county's employee privacy portal, an account Theo did not know existed, connected to an email address I had created specifically for professional record storage and never used for anything else. I organized the screenshots chronologically. I labeled the voice memo file with its date. I cross-referenced the printed email photograph against the notebook entry from the night I had found it, so that anyone going through the materials would see the 2 records confirm each other without me having to explain the connection. Then I sat back and looked at the organized file on my screen. 3 years of a 7-year-old being recruited as a messenger. 3 years of a woman who had decided on the first month of my marriage that she intended to position herself as the real female presence in my daughter's life. 3 years of a husband who had chosen, every single time, to reframe what I was seeing as a pattern problem in my own perception. I was not angry in the way people expect when they hear stories like this one. What I felt was closer to a specific kind of clarity that I had only ever felt at work, the feeling of looking at a file where the discrepancy was no longer ambiguous, where the numbers said what they said and there was no alternate interpretation available. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I slept. The breaking point came 11 days later on a Sunday. Sunday dinners had continued unchanged through all of it because nothing in my outward behavior had shifted. That was intentional. I had not altered a single routine, not canceled a single dinner, not given Nadine or Theo any signal that anything had changed. I was still the same person at that table. I was just also the person who had sent the complete file to Renata Ose 3 days earlier and received a confirmation reply that said, in Renata's precise language, "This is more than sufficient. I'll have draft language for the custody modification petition ready by Thursday." That Sunday, Theo was in the backyard dealing with a sprinkler system issue that had been ongoing for 2 weeks. Juniper was in the living room with Nadine. I was in the kitchen putting together a salad, close enough to hear without being visible. I heard Nadine's voice drop to the register she used for those particular conversations. "Low. Confidential. Junibug. Do you remember what we talked about?" "About Mommy's private feelings." Juniper's voice, careful in the way children are careful when they have learned there is a correct answer. "The things that make her upset?" Did anything happen this week that made her upset?" A silence. Then, she seemed sad when she was on the phone. Nadine's voice softened into something that was almost warm. "What kind of sad?" I set down the salad tongs. Very deliberately. I did not move for 3 seconds. Then I walked into the living room. Nadine looked up with the smooth composure of someone who believed she had not been heard. She smiled. We were just keeping each other company. I looked at Juniper first. "Baby, can you go get your shoes on? I thought we'd take a walk before dinner." Juniper looked between us again, that radar-skinned children do, and then slid off the couch and went down the hallway. When I heard her bedroom door, I turned to Nadine. Her expression had not changed. That was its own kind of tell. She always held her face too still when she thought she might be in trouble, like stillness was the same as innocence. "She's 7, I said. I kept my voice level. "You have been asking a 7-year-old to tell you when I am upset. For how long?" "You misheard something." I did not mishear anything. Her chin came up a fraction. "I am trying to be present for that child because someone in this family needs to be consistently present for her." There it was. The self-justification she had been running on for 3 years, finally said aloud. I had imagined this moment many times. I had imagined that hearing it would feel like something. What it actually felt like was a property record where the numbers finally made the discrepancy explicit. Clean. Usable. "Nadine." My voice stayed level. "Whatever you think you are doing, you need to understand that it is done." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Theo is going to want to hear about this conversation." "I'm sure he will." She stood up. She was several inches taller than me, and she used height the way some people use silence, as a statement. "You have never understood what this family is." "I understand it very well." She picked up her bag from the armchair, the large woven tote she always brought on Sundays, always set in the same armchair, always packed with things she would produce over the course of the evening as if she lived there. She pulled the strap onto her shoulder. Her hand gripped the strap tight. "I've been watching out for that little girl since before you decided she was a good addition to your life plan." I did not respond to that. There was nothing in it that required a response, and responding to it was not what I was there for. She walked out through the front door. I stood in the living room and listened to her car start in the driveway and back out into the street. I went down the hallway and knocked on Juniper's door. She was sitting on her bed with her shoes half on, watching the door with the expression children have when they know something important just happened, and they don't know if it is their fault. I sat down next to her and helped her with the second shoe. "Ready for a walk?" She studied me for a moment with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old conducting an assessment. "Is Auntie Nadine coming?" "Not tonight." She considered this. Then she took my hand and we went outside. We walked around the block twice. She told me about a book she was reading at school, about a girl who finds a secret garden. I listened to every word. When we got back to the house, she asked if we could have ice cream before dinner instead of after, and I said yes, and she accepted this with the total satisfaction of someone who has received a genuine gift. I got her to bed at 8:30. I sat down at my desk at 9. I opened my laptop. I opened the secure folder. I opened a new email address to Renata Ose. I typed, "I'm ready. Let's move." I attached everything, the full organized file, the school documents I had forwarded the week before, the notebook photograph sequence, the digital folder export, the voice memo, the screenshot archive. Every piece of it, labeled and cross-referenced exactly as I had organized it the night I had made the decision that I had enough. I went through the email once to verify that the attachments had all loaded. 7 attachments. Each one named clearly. Each one traceable to a specific date, a specific incident, a specific record. I pressed send. The email program made its small notification sound. A sound I had heard 1,000 times before. It meant nothing and it meant everything. I sat in the quiet of the office for a moment. The house was still. Theo was already in bed. He had come in from the yard, heard me say briefly that Nadine had left early, and had not pressed it. I had not pressed anything either. Not tonight. The stillness of that room felt different from the stillness of the past 3 years. This was not the stillness of waiting. This was the stillness that comes after a decision is fully made and there is nothing left to do but let the consequences travel at their own speed. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen and made tea, and I stood at the kitchen window while it steeped, and I looked out at the backyard where Theo had been working on the sprinkler system all afternoon. He had fixed the one in the far left corner. The grass there was already a slightly different shade of green from the water it had been getting. I noticed things. I always noticed things. It was the way my brain worked, as Theo had said, and he had meant it as a limitation, and it was not. At 9:47 in the evening, my phone showed a notification. An email reply from Renata Osei, which I had not expected at that hour. It said, received. I'll file the modification petition with the court first thing. Expect contact from the school district's family liaison office within 48 hours. I'll be looping them in. Keep your phone on. I set the phone face down on the counter. The first domino had not fallen yet, but I could hear it leaning. The 48 hours Renata had mentioned stretched into 53 before the first official contact came, and when it did not come to me first. It came to the school district's family liaison office, which then contacted Clearwater Elementary's principal, a measured woman named Dr. Felicia Huang, who had been in that role for 11 years and had a reputation for being precise and unhurried in situations where other administrators moved too fast and created complications. Mrs. Pemberton told me later that Dr. Huang had reviewed the incident documentation the same morning Renata's office made contact, had pulled Juniper's full file, and had initiated a standard welfare inquiry through the district's protocol within the hour. I knew none of this in real time. I found out in pieces, the way you find out about things when you are not the person being contacted. You are the person other people call when they are confused about why they are being contacted. Theo called me at 11:23 in the morning on a Tuesday while I was at my desk at the assessor's office. His voice had the particular quality of someone who is trying to sound neutral and not succeeding. The school called, he said. Okay. A pause. They want to schedule a meeting. With both of us. And a family liaison coordinator. When? They said as soon as possible. This week if we can. Another pause, longer. Do you know what this is about? I looked at the property transfer record open on my screen. I think it's about Juniper. Obviously, it's about Juniper. I mean, do you know why they're calling a formal meeting? I think we should hear what they have to say. He went quiet in the way that usually meant he was doing the mental work of deciding whether to push further. He decided not to. Fine. I'll call them back. Tell them Thursday works for me, I said. Mornings. I went back to the property record. My hands were steady. What I learned later, through Renata, who had a professional relationship with the district's legal office, was that in the 24 hours following that call, Nadine had contacted Dr. Huang's office twice. The first call, she identified herself as Juniper's aunt and asked what the meeting was regarding. Dr. Huang's assistant told her the meeting was a family matter and gave no further information, which was the correct institutional response and, I imagine, not what Nadine was expecting. The second call, she identified herself as a family representative and asked whether she could attend. Dr. Huang's assistant told her the meeting was scheduled for the child's legal guardians. The call ended there. I was not present for either of those calls. I did not know about them until after the meeting had already happened. But I have thought about them many times, about what it must have felt like to make those calls and encounter a wall instead of the usual compliance. Institutions do not respond to warmth and positioning the way family members do. They have protocols. They have documentation. They have a chain of command that does not care who you are at Sunday dinners. The Thursday meeting was in a conference room at Clearwater Elementary that smelled like whiteboard marker and cafeteria. Dr. Huang was already seated when Theo and I arrived. The district's family liaison coordinator, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Darren Achebe, sat beside her with a notepad. Renata had recommended I not bring her to this meeting. She said institutional education meetings go better without legal representation visible at the table, and that the documentation would speak without anyone having to perform it. I followed her guidance. Dr. Huang began by thanking us for coming quickly. Then she laid out, in precise and clinical language, what Mrs. Pemberton and the classroom aide had documented. She did not editorialize. She read from the record. She used Juniper's exact words as they had been transcribed. When she reached the part about Juniper saying that her stepmommy told her never to tell mommy, Theo's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. I saw it because I was watching. Mr. Achebe explained that under the district's child welfare protocol, a pattern of coaching a minor to conceal information from a parent, when identified by school staff, triggered a mandatory referral to the county's Child and Family Services intake line. Not a formal investigation yet. An intake. A preliminary assessment. The distinction was important, and he explained it carefully. Theo looked at me across the table. I met his eyes and held them without expression. This is about Nadine, he said. He said it to me, not to Dr. Huang. Dr. Huang answered before I could. The documentation describes behavior attributed to a non-parental adult in the child's life. The district's obligation is to the child's well-being, not to the identification of responsible parties. That's the intake office's function. Theo sat back in his chair. He pressed his fingertips together on the table, a gesture I had not seen him use before, the kind of thing people do when they are trying to keep their hands still. What does this mean for Juniper? It means a family services coordinator will make contact within the next 5 to 7 business days, Mr. Achebe said. It means we have a duty to document and report. It means Juniper will likely be spoken to by a trained child interview specialist, not in a way that is disruptive to her, but in a way that is appropriate to her age and her well-being. She's 7, Theo said. She is, Mr. Achebe agreed. The specialist works with children as young as 3. Juniper will be comfortable. We drove home separately. Theo had come from a job site. I had come from the office. In the parking lot, before he got to his truck, he stopped. His voice was lower than it had been in the meeting. How long have you known about this? I considered the question carefully. I've been paying attention for about 3 years. He stared at me. Something moved through his expression that I could not quite name. It was not anger, and it was not shock. It was closer to the look of someone who has just been shown a map of a place they thought they knew and discovered it has more features than they realized. He got in his truck. I got in my car. The Family Services Intake Coordinator, a woman named Ms. Bridget Okafor, called me 5 days later. She was thorough and professional, and she did not minimize anything I told her. She asked specific questions, and she wrote down specific answers, and she told me at the end of the call that she would be scheduling a home visit and that I should expect to be contacted by a child interview specialist regarding Juniper's session. What I had not anticipated, and what Renata had not mentioned as a specific possibility, though she was not surprised when I told her, was what Ms. Okafor said near the end of our call, almost as an aside. I should let you know, she said, that in the course of our intake process, we conducted a standard background check on all adults identified as regularly spending time with the child. There is an item in the record for the individual identified as the paternal aunt that we are going to need to follow up on separately. I kept my voice neutral. What kind of item? I can't share the specifics at this stage, but it's something our office will be addressing through its own process. It doesn't affect the timeline or scope of Juniper's assessment. I thanked her and hung up, and then I sat very still for about 30 seconds. I called Rosario. Her voice when she picked up was the voice she used when she already sensed something was coming. Tell me. The intake process turned up something in Nadine's background check. A pause. Then her fingers steeple thinking silence. Something you knew about? Something I had no idea about. Another pause. Well, she said, and she said it the way people say it when they are absorbing new information and recalibrating their picture of a situation. That would explain some things. It might explain everything. I found out what the item was 11 days later, not from MS. Okafor, who was appropriately restricted in what she could share, but from Renata, who had filed the custody modification petition and was receiving discovery through the family court process. What surfaced was a civil complaint from 4 years earlier, filed by a woman in an adjacent county, a former client of Nadine's real estate practice. The complaint alleged that Nadine had, during the course of a property transaction, used information about the client's minor child, health information, school information, custody status, obtained during personal conversations, and shared it with a third party in a way that materially affected the client's custody proceeding. The complaint had been settled privately. Non-disclosure agreement. Sealed. It had not appeared in any professional licensing review because the settlement had occurred before a formal ethics complaint was filed with the Real Estate Licensing Board. But it had appeared in the intake database. Because the intake database searches civil court records, including sealed settlements, when a child welfare referral is active. Renata's voice when she told me was careful in the way she was always careful, precise, and forward-looking rather than reactive. This changes the scope of what the court is going to consider in the modification petition, she said. A prior incident involving the use of a minor child's personal information in a custody matter, even settled, is material. What does material mean in practice? It means the judge will know about it. It means the guardian ad litem assigned to Juniper will know about it. It means the narrative of an isolated incident of coaching a child to keep secrets becomes, legally, a pattern. I sat with that for a moment. 3 years of a composition book and a digital folder and the careful habit of a woman who notices discrepancies, and then, surfacing from a background check I had not run and a complaint I had never seen, a pattern that predated me entirely. Nadine had done this before. I am not going to describe what happened to Theo's family in the days that followed as though it was satisfying to watch, because it was not. I had not set out to detonate anything. I had set out to protect my daughter. Those are related objectives, but they are not the same thing, and the difference mattered to me even when the results looked identical from the outside. What I can tell you is that Bev, Theo's older sister, the reserved one, the one who had always seemed peripheral to Nadine's orbit, called me on a Thursday evening about 2 weeks after the intake process began. She had not called me in the 3 years of my marriage to her brother. We had exchanged pleasantries at Sunday dinners and Christmas gatherings, and that was the full extent of our relationship. Her voice on the phone was controlled but effortful, like someone holding something heavy and trying not to let it show in their breathing. I want to understand what's happening, she said. What have you been told? She paused. Nadine says you've been building a case against her for years. That this is about the house. About the inheritance from our father. I had not known, until that moment, that there was a house or an inheritance in play. Theo and I had never discussed his father's estate in any specific terms. His father had passed before we met. I don't know anything about an inheritance, I said. Another pause. Longer. You don't. Bev, I have 3 years of documented interactions between Nadine and my daughter. I filed a custody modification petition because my 7-year-old stood in her classroom and said her stepmother had told her never to tell mommy. That is what this is about. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then, quietly, how long has she been doing this with Juniper? 8 months that I can document with school records. Years before that in ways that are harder to quantify. Bev's voice changed. Not dramatically, a small, careful shift, like a door opening a fraction. I have things I have seen. In our family. Going back further than your marriage. I know you don't have a reason to trust me, I said. That's not what I was going to say. Her voice dropped. I was going to say I should have said something sooner. And I didn't. And I am sorry for that. We talked for 40 minutes. I took no notes during the call, I simply listened. When I hung up, I picked up the composition book and I wrote down everything she had said, dated, and put it in the fire safe. Not because I needed it. Because it was the habit of 3 years, and some habits do not stop the moment they stop being necessary. The social consequences came more quietly than I expected, and from a direction I had not predicted. Nadine's real estate practice operated in a small professional community. The Real Estate Licensing Board received a formal complaint, not from me, not from Renata, but from MS. Okafor's office, which had an obligation to report findings to relevant professional licensing bodies when a credentialed adult was involved in a child welfare inquiry. The complaint did not allege criminal conduct. It alleged a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the ethical obligations of a licensed real estate professional, specifically the use of personal information obtained through client relationships for purposes unrelated to the professional engagement. The board opened a review. I did not know the review had been opened until a colleague of mine at the assessor's office mentioned it in passing. She handled some of the document verification for licensing disputes, and she mentioned, not knowing any connection to my life, that one of the local agents was under board review and that the timeline for those things could be extensive. I said, and went back to my work. What changed in Nadine's daily life was not dramatic from the outside and was, I imagine, completely dismantling from the inside. 2 of her current clients, people who had been following the listing she was managing, withdrew from their agreements and moved to different agents. In a small market where reputation is the primary business driver, 2 withdrawals in 1 month is not a statistic. It is a signal. Word had traveled in the way word travels in professional communities, sideways, through implication, in the language of people who don't want to say directly what they know. She stopped coming on Sundays. She did not call to cancel. She simply did not come. Theo noticed on the first Sunday she didn't appear. He stood in the kitchen at 6 in the evening looking at the driveway with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite anything I could name. I did not comment on it. I made dinner for the 2 of us and for Juniper, and we ate, and Juniper told us about the book she was still reading, the one about the girl with the secret garden, and said she had reached the part where the girl discovers the garden has been growing the whole time even when no one was tending it. Theo looked at me over the top of Juniper's head. I looked back at him. I had explained to Juniper, in the days after the school meeting, at the level a 7-year-old can hold, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about how to show love, that sometimes they think doing things secretly is protecting someone, but it usually isn't. That she had not done anything wrong. That she had done, in fact, exactly what she was supposed to do. She had told the truth. Juniper had listened to all of this with the focused gravity she applied to things that mattered. Then she had asked if she still had to be nice to Auntie Nadine. I had told her she always got to choose how she spent her kindness. That it was hers. She had thought about it. Then she had said, I think I need a break. I had said, that's a reasonable thing to feel. She had nodded and gone back to her book. The licensing board's review took 4 months. In that time, the custody modification petition moved through the family court system with a speed I attributed to the guardian ad litem's report, which Renata described to me as thorough and favorable. The guardian ad litem, an attorney named Mr. Felix Oduya, who specialized in representing children's interests in family court, had spoken with Juniper twice, with Mrs. Pemberton, with MS. Okafor's office, and had reviewed the full documentation file. His report to the court recommended a formal prohibition on unsupervised contact between Juniper and any non-parental adult who had been identified in the child welfare inquiry, pending a 12-month review period. The court adopted the recommendation. Nadine's attorney, because she had retained one by the time the modification petition was active, filed a response arguing that the restriction was excessive and that the guardian ad litem's report relied too heavily on a single school incident. The judge reviewed the complete documentation file, including the civil complaint from 4 years prior. The response was denied. Renata called me the morning of the ruling. Her voice carried the specific quality of someone delivering news they consider correct and complete. The restriction is in place, she said. 12-month review period. At the 12-month mark, Judge Peralta will assess based on whether there has been any contact attempt or any further evidence of influence over the child. If the 12 months are clean, the restriction is revisited. If they are not, it becomes permanent. What does clean mean specifically? No contact with Juniper outside of supervised family events. No communication through Theo or anyone else that is directed at Juniper. No further school inquiries or institutional contacts regarding the child. I was sitting at my desk at the assessor's office. The same desk where I had stepped into the hallway to take Mrs. Pemberton's call. The same fluorescent light. The same distant sound of a copy machine down the corridor. Okay, I said. There's one more piece, Renata said. The Guardian ad litem's report has been forwarded to the Real Estate Licensing Board as a supporting document in their review. Mr. Oduya's office filed it independently. It's within his authority when he considers it relevant to a licensee's professional conduct. The board's review is now running on a parallel track. I thanked her. I sat for a moment after the call ended. Then I went through the property record that was open on my screen and finished the assessment I had started before the phone rang. The meeting with Nadine was not something I had planned. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the ruling, at Theo's family home, his parents' house, where Bev had invited the family for a lunch that Theo and I attended and that Nadine had apparently not known we would be at. When she walked into the kitchen and saw me standing at the counter talking to Bev, she stopped. Not the frozen stop of the conference room doorway that was still to come, that came later, weeks after this moment. This was a different stop. The stop of someone recalibrating in real time. She looked at Bev. Bev did not look away. Nadine set her bag on the armchair, the same automatic motion I had watched for years, the woven tote, the same armchair when one was available. Her hand gripped the strap tight and released it. Released it this time. Something in the pattern was already gone. I let Bev make herself busy in the other room. Nadine and I were alone in the kitchen. I want to know what you want, she said. Her voice was level, but it took effort. I want my daughter to grow up without being someone's informant. Her chin came up. An old reflex. That is not what I was doing. Nadine. I kept my voice even. I did not move toward her or away from her. I have 3 years of dated entries. I have the school documentation. I have a Guardian ad litem's report. I have a family court ruling. I have a licensing board review running on a parallel track. And I have a civil complaint from 4 years ago that was sealed, but not invisible. She went very still. I know about the client, I said. I know this is not the first time. A long silence. She looked at a point past my shoulder, the middle distance look of someone whose internal map has just been redrawn without their consent. Her jaw worked slightly. She pressed her lips together. I thought, she started, and then she stopped. What did you think? She looked at me then. Something in her face had shifted below the controlled surface, not collapsed, not theatrical, but genuinely altered. Like a building that is still standing, but has lost a structural element. I thought I was the only one who actually saw her, she said. Juniper. I thought I was the only one paying attention. I looked at her for a long moment. This was the humanizing moment I had always known existed somewhere inside what she did, and I had waited 3 years to see it, and now that I was looking at it I felt no satisfaction and no anger. I felt something closer to exhaustion. She is a mother who pays attention, I said. She has always had that. What she did not need was someone convincing her it was a secret. Nadine looked away. Her hand found the strap of the bag in the armchair, the reflex, and held it. What happens now? She asked. The court order describes exactly what happens now. You should review it with your attorney. I mean with the family. I considered that for a moment. I think that depends on whether you can honestly look at what you did and name it for what it was. Not to me. To yourself. She did not answer. That was its own answer. I picked up my glass from the counter and walked out of the kitchen to find Juniper, who was in the backyard with Theo's parents, chasing a dog that belonged to the neighbors and had somehow gotten through the fence. I stood at the back door and watched her run, laughing, her arms wide, completely present in the specific joy of a 7-year-old chasing a dog on a Saturday afternoon. The licensing board issued its formal findings 6 weeks after that kitchen conversation. The board found, by a vote of 5-2, that Nadine Castellano had engaged in conduct inconsistent with the ethical standards of a licensed real estate agent. specifically regarding the use of client-adjacent personal information in ways not authorized by her professional engagement. Her license was placed on a 12-month probationary status, with a formal notation in her public licensing record. The notation would remain regardless of whether she renewed her license. In a market where reputation is the primary business driver, a public probationary notation is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a permanent recalibration of what clients will find when they search her name. She had built her professional identity on the idea that she understood families and how they made decisions. That she could be trusted inside the most private conversations people have about where to live and how to arrange their lives. The notation said, officially, that her understanding of professional boundaries had been found deficient. She could appeal the finding. Her attorney told her the appeal was unlikely to alter the notation. She did not appeal. The last formal piece was the family court's 12-month review marker, which was set for a Thursday morning with Judge Peralta. Renata appeared on my behalf. Nadine's attorney appeared for her. The 12 months had been clean, no contact attempts, no school inquiries, no institutional contacts involving Juniper. Judge Peralta reviewed Mr. Oduya's follow-up assessment, which noted that Juniper was, in his professional observation, a well-adjusted child with a strong primary attachment to her mother and a healthy relationship with her stepfather. Judge Peralta lifted the contact restriction and replaced it with a standing order, not a prohibition, but a requirement. Any adult non-guardian who wished to have regular, unsupervised contact with Juniper had to be approved by both legal guardians. Both. Not one. Both. It was, as Renata described it, a permanent structural change. Not a punishment. A framework. One that meant that nothing like what had happened for 3 years could happen again without my explicit consent. I signed the acknowledgement form and walked out of the courthouse into an ordinary Thursday morning. In the months that followed, Nadine's professional practice contracted significantly. She transitioned from representing buyers and sellers in residential transactions to a smaller role in commercial property management, a field where client relationships are transactional and personal trust is less central to the work. She moved to a condo in a neighboring city. She still came to some family gatherings. She was quieter at them. She sat in different chairs. Bev and I had coffee twice in the following year. She was not someone I would have sought out under other circumstances, but she was someone who had looked at what her sister had done and chosen not to defend it, and in my experience, that choice costs people something real. I respected the cost she had paid. We were not close friends. We were two people who had been through the same storm from different positions, and we were both still standing. Theo and I had harder conversations in the year after the ruling than we had in the 3 years before it. Some of those conversations went somewhere useful. Some of them revealed distances that had always existed and that I had been patient enough, or perhaps careful enough, not to examine directly. We were still married at the 12-month mark. We were trying, in the specific way that two people try when they have both had to revise their understanding of what they were dealing with. Juniper finished the book about the secret garden. She told me the ending on a Sunday evening while I was making dinner. She stood at the counter next to me and narrated the whole final chapter from memory, with the loose improvised additions that children make when they are retelling something they loved. In the book, the garden had been growing the whole time, even in winter, even when no one was there to see it. She looked up at me when she finished. Did you know it was going to be okay? I thought about the composition book, the fire safe, the digital folder, the email I had pressed send on. The 47 days between Mrs. Pemberton's call and the morning I walked out of the courthouse on an ordinary Thursday. I had a pretty good idea, I said. She accepted this with the completeness of a 7-year-old who has received the answer she was looking for. Then she asked if we were having pasta, and I said yes, and she went to set the table. I stood at the stove and listened to the sound of her moving through the house, the specific, ordinary sound of a child who is safe and does not know they are being listened to, which is the most complete sound I know. The question I have thought about most in the time since is not what Nadine did or why. It is this: at what point does loving someone else's child become something that belongs to you? At what point does the feeling of being essential become a justification for making yourself essential in ways that were never offered to you? I don't think Nadine ever found the line between those two things. I think she genuinely believed that what she was doing was protection. I think that belief was the most dangerous thing about her. If you have been watching until the end, tell me in the comments, was there a moment in this story where you would have done something differently than she did? And if this kind of story belongs in your regular rotation, subscribing takes about 3 seconds, and it means you will be here for the next one.